and another pair from BSEC. So CROCUS is going to start. So we're going to have Dimitrios Fytanidis, and we're going to have Haochen Tan. So Dimitrios is a computational earth scientist in Environmental Science Division at Oregon National Lab, and he joined Oregon after a PhD at UIUC in 2020. And Dimitri's expertise is really leading the efforts on modeling street-scale process dynamics at sub-meter resolution, in addition to many other things that Dimitrios is involved with at CROCUS. And Haochen joined Oregon in 2021 as a postdoc and now works as an assistant atmospheric scientist in the Environmental Science Division, and has expertise in regional and urban climate modeling, with a focus in particular on investigating the impact of urbanization and climate change on local atmospheric conditions and energy consumption. So with that, Dimitrios, I think you can share screen and you guys can take over, and I'll keep a timer for 25 minutes. So floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are physically located. Today, as Paula said, we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of our high resolution modeling and efforts on capturing really the urban heterogeneity from street scale to mesoscale modeling. This is part of efforts that many more CROCUS members are involved, but as Paolo said, I will present the high fidelity, like meter scale resolution modeling, and Haochen will continue with the mesoscale modeling for the city of Chicago. And of course, when we are talking about modeling of energy Earth systems across scale, we do everything from global, regional, local, and hyperlocal modeling. But my talk, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, will focus on the last two, the local and hyperlocal simulations, and how we bridge the gaps between a kilometer, 580 meter simulation with the dynamics and processes that occur in meter and sub-meter. And I know many of you wonder why high resolution modeling. It's 2025. We have all these great AI tools. We can build digital twins. Are really high fidelity simulations and measurements relevant? And please allow me to give an analog, hopefully a funny analog of a digital twin in 2025. And I will start with a picture of this Måneskin cat that we are all familiar from memes in the web and post online, that let's say represents a real energy and Earth system. Well, the state-of-the-art models can capture pretty much 50 to 60% of the processes and dynamics and behavior of this system. And now we have the choice whether we will provide, improve, and detailed data set to build the actual digital twin. And I would say that if we decide to go with what we have, we might start with a digital twin that looks a lot like the top figure on the right, where we have a model that can predict the general behavior, but specific characteristics and behaviors of the physical system, the fidelity of the prediction might depend on the data availability. However, if we continue to provide improve and detailed data set, we will have a good enough representation, a digital twin, that we can use to optimize simulate and analyze the system on the fly in the real world and real-time applications. Now, that's what we are working on CROCUS. We combine continuous real-time observational data from the observational team with high-fidelity multi-scale simulations, and of course, interpretable and generalizable data-driven algorithms working towards a digital twin of urban Chicago and the energy infrastructure. And now, from vision to practice, what we are heading towards is like improving the urban representation in energy Earth system models. And this starts adopting a model observation experimentation approach. We use models to basically inform field campaigns and sensor placement within the urban Chicago, and then data from observational campaigns and measurements that take place real time to basically improve the conceptual models and refine the process and system modeling approaches in our high fidelity simulations. Now, one of the challenges here is that the urban heterogeneity is difficult to capture, particularly in big cities like Chicago. We have everything from tall buildings, skyscrapers with dense urban canopies to big, large buildings that might be industrial use, all the way to street scale, neighborhood scale buildings and trees. And this is very tricky to model, but it's crucial to improve all this parameterization, particularly given that we have access lately to really detailed building and tree dataset. For example, for the city of Chicago, we have the heights of trees and buildings dataset developed by colleagues in DPI, and that UT Globul's dataset that is developed from our friends in University of Texas. And basically, HiTab focuses in Chicago. UT Global has data for several cities in the United States and globally. So all this new data require us to rethink how we parameterize urban canyons and urban canopies. And of course, we can always get all this data and perform street scale simulations to predict what happens at 2 meters, like inside the canopy. But these CFD simulations, these 3D building resolving simulations, are firstly computationally expensive, and secondly, they might not be suitable for long-term integration, which might be crucial to study the long-term effect on urban regions and urban energy infrastructure. Now, this is why building effect parameterization schemes are always useful when we cannot really resolve what happens within the canopies. And one of the most commonly applied closures is the building effect parameterization scheme developed by Santiago and Martilli in 2010. Which basically works under the assumption that all the flow and turbulent characteristics below the height of the building is basically uniform, which means all these eddies representing the flow structure below the height of the building basically is uniform, and the size of these eddies is relevant to estimate what is known as eddy diffusivity, which then drives all the momentum, energy, and mass fluxes that we estimate within the canopy. Now, this is a representation, a cartoon representation, basically, of what the classic BP scheme would predict for the flow structure. And on the left side, I just plotted some high-fidelity, large eddy simulations of a canonical case with an array of cubes. This is a slice of the domain, and I visualize the velocity. And you can see that the structure below the building is not really uniform. It seems that there are many up and downs in the velocity. And even from a turbulent phenomenology point of view, we would expect that above the canopy we have the formation of what is known as a rough boundary layer Prandtl scaling, where the eddies grow as we move further away from the canopy, and we have an equivalent but small scale street scale boundary layer that develops inside the canopy, and then a shear layer that basically mixes these two boundary layers. Indeed, when we perform large eddy simulations of a various range of idealized case, we saw that actually below the height of the building, where z divided by h gets the value of 1, we have a variability of the size of the eddies and the turbulent structure inside basically the canopy. And here I show the predictions with gray of the standard BP adopted in mesoscale model, in many mesoscale models, basically. With black, I have a model that we proposed. Basically, what we did is we create some closure equations to predict the maximum mixing length, the location within the canopy, where this maximum length occurs, and as well as the height of the size of the eddies at the interface at the height of the building. And why this is relevant? Well, for CROCUS, I plot here the density parameter lambda p that was used for the closures, and you can see that actually we have a wide range of densities in CROCUS, but most of the city is in this light green, light blue color, where actually we are talking about sparse canopies, where we saw basically the large deviation of the standard BP model compared with the high fidelity simulations. Now, when we actually implemented these closures and we compared against high fidelity simulations, we did an okay job predicting both the velocity and the Reynolds stresses profiles inside and above the canopy, but we focus here on the eddy diffusivity, which is basically, as I said, as a reminder, the way we estimate all the energy and mass fluxes inside the canopy, and we saw that the improved parameterization reduces the error by 50 to 60% for eddy viscosity and by 50% to the mixing length. But the eddy viscosity is more interesting because that's what actually drives the fluxes. All the fluxes are basically multiplied by this eddy diffusivity. Now, another question that people may have is that, well, cities are not arrays of cubes. And indeed, we processed data from real world application where we have variable heights of buildings in Northfield Township, which is a neighborhood in Chicago, very close to one of our nodes where we take continuous measurements. And we saw that actually our profile very much matches large eddy simulations of a real world neighborhood. And here I also showed some examples of predictions with real cities across the globe and in the United States, like Phoenix and Manhattan. And you can see that our proposed model improves the prediction of standard BP. Now, going back to Chicago, we have some nodes that we get continuous measurements of temperature, humidity, velocities, and many other meteorological parameters, including measurements of air quality. But today I want to focus just on the results for temperature and relative humidity. And I show you here with circles the measurements we took in some specific locations in Chicago, and with black line, the proposed model, and gray, the predictions of the standard BP. On the left side, I have the temperature, right side, the relative humidity, and you can see we do an okay job predicting basically the dynamics. And when we go to some scatter plots showing observed versus model temperature and relative humidity, I want you to focus on the fitting lines here. And you can see that actually the slope of the lines approach more the one-to-one slope that would be a perfect match. And also we reduce the intersect values, showing clearly that we reduce the bias using the improved canopy variable, basically mixing length approach. And this is the case both for temperature, but also for relative humidity, where we see exactly the same trends. Now, what else happens when you introduce this improved parameterization is that the temperature within the urban areas change distribution. While the average temperature may not change dramatically, we are around 24 degrees, we can see that locally we get spikes and differences of up to 3 degrees when we actually take into consideration the turbulent phenomenology and the variability of mixing length within the canopy. And with this, I want basically to summarize that the existing parameterization had inadequately represent the canopy turbulence, causing errors in the momentum, temperature, humidity predictors. And we use high fidelity simulations to come up with a new turbulent mixing length closure for urban canopies. The improved closure gives 50 to 60% improvement in the prediction of eddy diffusivity and the accuracy of predicting momentum, heat, and moisture change between the urban canopy and atmosphere. And the variability shows that we have a difference up to 3 degrees compared to traditional parameterization scheme. And the validation showed that actually we reduced the biases in temperature and relative humidity predictions. And with this, I will pass to Haochen, who's gonna talk to you about the LES scale modeling we do with CROCUS.
Sure, thanks, Dimitrios. So hello everyone. My part of presentation today is about integrating the warp comfort at LES scale with the BEM and high-tech data for Chicago region. Next slide, please. So a bit of introduction of the LES. So as we further push the numerical weather prediction model like warp to resolution of less than 100 meters, the model begins to transition to large eddy simulation, which is the LES mode. So the boundary layer contains a range of kind of a wide range of scales, and these scales influence how we represent the eddies in the model. So typically the boundary layer eddies have scales ranging from 100 meters to about a kilometer, with most of the energy concentrated on these scales. So depending on the model resolution, these scales may be either resolved or not. So for typical grid size in the mesoscale, the grid resolution is much larger than the size of dominant eddies, and parameterized boundary layer schemes are used to represent them, which is called the RANS. So in this case, all eddies are considered subgrid, and the 1D column schemes are applied to handle the vertical velocities. So however, when we use the LES scale resolution, the model can directly resolve these eddies and allow the turbulence to be treated as three-dimensional phenomena. So one of our key objectives in the CROCUS project is to push the numerical weather prediction model into LES scale to simulate the urban microclimates more accurately. So by achieving this, we aim to better capture the intricate turbulence dynamics that influence the urban thermal environment. So this advancement will help us understand how urban heat islands and other localized climate phenomena respond to the fine scale interaction between urban structures, the vegetation, and the atmospheric process. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a comparison of urban land use categories at 2 different spatial resolutions, 500 meters and 80 meters. So at 500 meter resolution, the urban areas are generally represented with coarser details, which can lead to a broader categorization of land use types. So on the other hand, as we move to 80 meter resolution, the model can capture much more details. For example, in the areas where the dense high residential buildings, there are much more precise representation of how buildings are arranged and their relationship to the surrounding environment. Additionally, the finer details of non-urban areas such as lakes, forests, and vegetation are more clearly in the delineant at 80 meter scales. So at coarser resolution, these areas may be averaged out or oversimplified. Whereas the LES scales, the distinction between different types of non-urban areas are much clearer. Next slide, please. So another important component we are using right now is the building effect parameterizations, the BEP, and the building energy mode, the BEM. So which are both important components for simulating urban microclimates and energy use. The BEP helps modeling the effect of urban morphology on the local climate, providing valuable data for the microclimate studies and the urban planning. So in combination with the BEP, the BEM offers a detailed approach to understanding how buildings respond to the heat, to the air conditioning and energy demands. It is crucial for the optimizing the energy efficiency and designing the urban areas with better thermal comfort. Next slide, please. So another new methodology we use to simulate the heat stress at the city scale is the warp comfort. So as we know, the urban areas are experiencing the increasing thermal discomfort due to the global warming and urban environment. So the primary factors contributing to the urban heat stress include include the air temperature, the wind speed, the mean radiant temperature, and humidity. So while the temperature and humidity often varies over large scales, factors like wind speed or the mean radiant temperature can differ significantly within small spaces, such as the city streets, due to the urban environment and local topography. So traditionally, most studies on the urban heat stress have relied on the mesoscale models, which focus on the small urban domains, such as the individual neighborhoods or the street blocks, and typically simulating the short timeframes, often just a few hours. Well, these models are useful for understanding the localized heat stress. They are not fully capture the effects of the citywide adaptation or mitigation strategies because they are limited on both spatial and temporal resolution. So to overcome this limitation, we use the new model developed by Alberto Martelli to assess the heat stress on the much larger scales across entire cities or the long time scales, ranging from minutes to years. So this approach allows us to evaluate the effectiveness of the adaptation strategy and their impact on the urban heat stress at the city level. So this methodology consists like 3 key steps: the estimation of mean radiant temperature in various street locations and orientations, the downscaling of wind speed based on the local urban morphology, and then computation of the thermal stress index showing the distribution within each grid square. So through this approach, we can map out the intra-neighborhood heat stress distribution and better understand how the heat stress varies throughout the city, especially in the complex area like street canyons. So this methodology not only helps in the real-time assessments, but also can be used to study the long-term trends and the effects of future urban expansion and climate change. Next slide, please. So with the model resolution of 80 meters, a more detailed data on urban morphology is required for accurate urban microclimate simulation. The vertical dimension of urban morphology, particularly the height of trees and buildings, have significant impact on the wind flow in the urban street canyons and thermal environment of the urban fabric, which in turn affect the overall microclimates. So as shown here, the default urban data used by WRF model relies on the new depth data at the 1 kilometer scales, which also does not cover the entire Chicago region. The new high type data, however, provides a more detailed information, mapping the height of trees and building across the city of Chicago at 1 meter spatial resolution. So this was archived throughout a data fusion approach that integrates high precision LiDAR point cloud data, the building footprint inventories, and multi-satellite images. So as seen in the figure below, the improvement are quite evident in the building height and building surface ratio across the Chicago region. Next slide, please. So the model configurations, we conduct two sets of simulations: the RANS with 500 meter resolution and the LES with 80 meter resolution. We used 4 domains for the 80 meter. We use 4 domains with 80 meter for the innermost domain, and the initial and boundary conditions are using ER5. The SSD is updated by Great Lake surface water temperature data, and the simulation time is the first day of IOP1. No PBL schemes is used for the 3rd and 4th domain of LES simulation. Instead, the 3D TKE LES PBL scheme is used. It is the parameterization of subgrid turbulence mixing, and it is self-adaptive to the grid size between the large eddy stimulation and mesoscale limits. Next slide, please. All right, yeah, that's one. Thanks. All right, the result part for the wind and the temperature. So for the temperature, both simulation shows generate increase from the lake to the inland areas. So the 80 meter simulation shows a warmer temperature concentrated in the urban core of the Chicago. With higher resolution, the temperature maps provides a more detailed view of temperature variation across the Chicago regions. The localized hotspots are quite visible and indicating the variation in the temperature due to different urban structures and land cover. For the near surface wind, the LES shows greater detail in wind patterns across the Chicago region. The wind speeds are more variable across the urban fabric, showing the low wind speed in the high build-up areas and the higher speeds in the open spaces. Next slide, please. The comparison between the 4 CROCUS stations and the model shows that the simulated temperature is quite aligned with the observation, but the wind speed is a bit underestimated. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the temperature distribution by the local climate zone types. So as we can see, the temperature differences are more pronounced in the LES simulation. The temperature is quite uniform in the range. The LCZ-A, which is a large, low residential categories, has the highest temperature on average on both RANS and LES scale simulation. So less differences between the rural and urban in the RANS simulation, meaning that weaker urban-rural temperature gradient. The LES simulation captures a more detailed and varied temperature distribution across the different LCD types, and especially in the urban areas. So this highlights the model ability to simulate the finer scale microclimates and localized variation in the temperature. Next slide. That's all we have for today, and thank you all for the attention and support throughout the presentation. We would like to express our gratitude to our colleagues and collaborators for their invaluable contribution and hard work, and looking forward to continuing our work together to exciting possibility ahead. If there are any questions, Dimitrios and I are happy to discuss them at the end of presentation. Thank you.
Very well done, 24 minutes and 49 seconds. So really awesome done. So we're gonna pass it to BSEC. We have two presenters as well. So Jason Horne and Eliott Foust, they're both PhD students. Jason focuses on boundary layer meteorology, turbulence near the surface and land surface processes. And particularly today, we're gonna see work on the urban environments, combined in a suite of measurements from BSEC with high resolution, largely simulation. So you see there's going to be a lot of overlap between the two presentations, which is great. And Eliott's work focuses on modeling urban climate and heat mitigation strategies. And so the work that we're going to see really goes at improving weather and climate models to represent urban features such as building, green spaces and infrastructure to improve models so they can better predict heat stress, and also for testing essentially how effective mitigation strategies are. So I'm going to pass it to you guys, and 25 minutes again. If you keep it within that, we have about 3 minutes for questions. So I encourage the audience in the meantime to put questions in the chat. And I don't know which one of you is sharing screen, but you're ready to go.
Eliott, you can go first.
Maybe Peter, just since you stay with the LES simulations.
Oh, you want me to go first? All right,
Yeah.
I can go first.
That works great.
Okay.
Timer, so if you're over the 25 minutes, I'll interrupt you.
Yeah,
just,
no worries. Let me see. Gotta get this thing all the way set up. Sorry, I was not expecting to go.
You're good.
Let me see. I think it's this one. Can you see that?
It's coming.
All right.
And great. Go for it, Jason.
Okay, let me put a little pointer here. So, all right, let's continue with the LES simulation stuff. Doing a very similar sort of methodology to what the two colleagues had just spoken about. I'm going to be using WRF LES to downscale from the synoptic to the mesoscale all the way down to microscale at the neighborhood level, and seeing how well we can actually capture neighborhood heterogeneities as validated by observations, right? That's a very important sort of part of this entire framework is, right, you have these simulations, but you also need to back them up using real world observations. And there's an awesome amount of data being collected by the BSEC Encourage team that we'll be using to interrogate these observations and model results. Okay, let's get into it. So here is essentially the framework, very similar again what the colleague just spoke about, where you've got essentially an outermost domain run in RAND sort of mesoscale fashion, and you're going and tunneling down to 1 kilometer resolution, right? And so once you pass 1 kilometer resolution going in, I should say horizontal resolution, you're then going down, and we're going to tunnel down in the neighborhood scale. And you're going into LES mode here, where you're switching from a PBL scheme to an actual LES representation of the flow patterns, doing 3D diffusion of the turbulent motions. Anyway, we're beginning to resolving these large eddies. So again, we're going and tunneling down specifically over this neighborhood in downtown Baltimore that has a lot of cultural significance. and has really been a focal point of the BSEC project at large. So how much variability exists across that neighborhood? Well, that's a great question. Here's a little bit of a blown up depiction of it. You can see there's a whole lot of heterogeneity just within this one neighborhood. You've got green space areas, you've got buildings of different shapes and sizes across this space. And we ask the question now, okay, how well can we actually capture this in default wharf configuration, right? And I should also say, here is a little bit of a depiction of the heterogeneity. Via a Landsat skin surface temperature image, you can see it gets pretty hot. This is in the middle of the summer at around 16 UTC, and we see the exact contrast we would expect between the green space and the surrounding urban areas, right? But it's getting very hot. This is actually during a heat wave. So the question is that how well can mesoscale simulations at 1 kilometer resolution of WRF pick this up? And we're going to be using this exact same product that they were talking about earlier, an LCZ description. This is at 100-meter resolutions. This is kind of a product that's being pushed largely by INCAR at the moment to represent and model these urban environments. You can see it tries to capture different LCZs that exist within our areas, how well it captures them, and if it's miscategorized them, et cetera, how they're being used in the model remains to be seen, and we'll kind of get to that here in a moment. But you can see it is trying to capture some amount of heterogeneity, right? And these are, again, different categorizations based on the urban form and fabric that exist in that area. So you're going to assign certain statistical parameters for the buildings that exist in that spot to feed into the urban canopy model, or certain land cover parameters for other parts of the model, right? So this is just basically determining parameterizations that go in the modeling framework. So here's 1 kilometer wharf. You can see here's the domain again, a Landsat temperature. We're far too cool, and we're really not capturing any of that skin surface temperature variability, right? This is 16 UTC, so we're a little bit off the timestamp there, but really we're not able to capture it at 1 kilometer. And I should say this is one setup of WRF using no MP with the BEP model turned on, but there's tons of different ways you can try and finagle this to capture this thing. Let's tunnel down again. Here's at 37-meter resolutions of the LES. You can really begin to see the artifacts from the land surface representation that you fed the LES. And you can really, again, compare that to our Landsat, and it's still too cold. And you're kind of seeing these artifacts that aren't really shown in this surface temperature map from Landsat, right? So again, we're kind of moving towards a more realistic depiction. You've even got heterogeneity across the park to the different land cover categories of the vegetation in the park. That's a whole nother suite of questions. How well can we actually capture and represent these urban grass and tree systems? But again, you can see it's not really doing the job here. That's the BEP model going on there. So what we're going to do and what we've been doing, and I'm sorry, I don't really have enough time to show all of the awesome results we've got here, but I'll show a little bit. I'm going to really kind of try and emphasize these awesome data collected. We've got in this one domain multiple surface weather stations been deployed by community members and led by Darren Waugh, and they've been doing great work out there. We've got a small stature flux tower that Ben Allsweet and I are really using to collect data from these turf lawns and things like that, looking at surface entered Big G balance and water and heat fluxes from a grass, which is an incredibly abundant ecosystem type within these urban areas, right? You've got the Courage system and the Courage deployment going on in there, collecting data from a Ka band radar. You've got vertical profiles of the Doppler LiDAR in the location, high fidelity radiation measurement. The list goes on and on and on. And the center linchpin of this whole thing that I have basically used and to base the domain configuration around is a multi-layer, multi-height anemometer tree. So we're actually collecting turbulence measurements out in the urban canopy in one of these areas. We've got two of them out in BSEC. This is a domain, right, targeting specifically around this flux tower, but we can use this to then validate results from these urban canopy models. When they're recreating the eddy diffusivities, as Dimitrios talked about, when they're recreating the turbulent length scales and trying to represent these things, the wind profiles, are they actually getting the right answer? Is it a problem with the physical configuration? The answer is yes. The physical consideration in the developed BEM, as Dimitrios pointed out, is not quite right at the moment. And we're, like our colleagues there are showing, we're kind of pushing that in the right direction. But again, continue to push it in the directions and validating it using observations on the ground, right? So really awesome stuff going on. I was really happy to hear that work from Dimitrios and the other colleagues. So it's awesome. Here's just a little bit of preliminary results comparing 2-meter temperature measurements made at the surface weather observations to the output from the LES. You can see we don't have a lot of variability, which I was a little surprised about over this short period I'm showing. From the LES and the 2-meter or the observations, you can see the LES in this sort of configuration is running too cool. largely, right? Looking at the grass field, here's some sensible heat fluxes off the grass, the turf grass. You can see we do an okay job with the sensible heat fluxes. That's not too terrible, right? There's obviously some clouds being simulated here that aren't being captured in reality, but that's just the name of the game. You're not going to get those perfectly right. What we do see a systematic bias in, as well as the 2-meter temperature, is also like latent heat fluxes off these lines, right? So we're not moving enough water from the surface up into the atmosphere. So you're not getting the buoyancy sort of things correctly in that localized zones and the thermal stresses and things like that, at least not for the right reasons if you're not putting the right amount of liquid in there, right? So there's a lot of work going on actively. So it's not just buildings even too, right? This is a complex mosaic of different land use types, soil that has been disturbed, et cetera, et cetera. And like the colleagues had said formerly, there's a lot of awesome data that is being readily available now. And I will say the default data available in model configurations like WRF is not going to cut it when you're trying to go down to these super high resolutions. So what I've done is I've created custom products that I've derived from things like Sentinel, or this is Polaris, which is a soil map. And I've actually made this so it's multi-layer. You've got texture changes with depth, et cetera, to try and capture this. And this is actually being interrogated and validated by some of the soil scientists that we're in collaboration with at BSEC. So that's really cool as well. But we're actually plugging this in and then seeing in this fully coupled system, how well can we recreate, right? And so we talked about UT Globus and things like that prior, doing a little bit of investigation. To at least my scenario, it wasn't doing a super great job. So I built a completely custom high resolution set of inputs for the entire city of Baltimore for BEP-BIM at 37-meter resolution. This is an example of just mean building height. And again, right, we're trying to evaluate this multi-layer urban canopy model using the WRF LES simulations, moving past just this generic LCZ descriptions. And the whole goal is advancing as we began to move, how the colleagues talked before, and there's much more push towards going towards sub-kilometer resolution, where you're continuing to then apply a urban canopy model that was developed for a mesoscale framework within the LAS framework, right? And how well you do when you get into what I call the urban gray zone sort of situation, that's up for debate. And it needs a little more investigation, right? Because maybe we need to advance, like Dimitrios showed us with that awesome results, and continue to push these to actually uniquely represent when you go to these finer representation scales. And of course, it's not a high resolution talk without showing like meter scale resolutions. This is a fully coupled LES simulation that I did using those WRF LES outputs to force a high resolution meter scale simulation. This is the T2 simulated. I just actually produced these yesterday, but it's pretty cool, just kind of showing the amount of variability. So then you actually have the statistical representation of the building used by BEP-BIM. In the LES framework, you have building resolving. This is fully coupled. I have the high resolution meter scale soil data, vegetation description at meter scale. I've got profiles of the trees, the buildings, like the whole 9 yards is in there. See, okay, if we actually begin to resolve these features like in a more local like meter scale thing, how does that compare to the statistical representation that's being used? And how do, again, looping this all back, compare to observations? All right, I'm going to shut up now. Eliott, go ahead.
Thanks, Jason. And please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, looks good.
Cool. So given our time, I'm just going to jump straight into it. And good afternoon, everyone. And so I want to talk to you about two of my research interests, one being looking at these mesoscale temperature patterns in the greater Baltimore area and how they serve as a proxy for heat exposure. And I'm going to cover that very briefly, but the bulk of this is going to be about implementing some mitigation strategies with the WRF model and the unique way that we're going about it. So I'll start off with our domain. Jason kind of showed this, but I'm looking at this from a larger scale. Center is Baltimore, and for reference, the outline in the lower left is Washington, D.C. And all of these markers show MADIS observations, which are a NOAA product. And they're color-coded since this is an amalgamation of many different data sets, in which some of them are crowdsourced. But we noticed that there's some observations missing in the city of Baltimore. And then, as Jason mentioned, Darren Waz led an effort with a lot of the BSEC community partners and along with Shamar Collins for deploying these stations within Baltimore. So that's why you see all these black circles here. And for this work, I'm going to be looking at it from August 2024. So you can think of this in terms of mean temperatures. And I'm using the WRF model at 1 kilometer resolution. So I'm staying out of the LES world as compared to the other few talks. And jumping straight into some of the results, what you're looking at are mean temperatures for the month of August. And so I have an afternoon period and nighttime period. And this panel in the upper left, these markers show the mean temperatures of all of these stations. The shading in the background is an interpolated temperature, particularly universal kriging, that we've used to, one, to fill in all the gaps between these observations, and two, it separates this mesoscale temperature variability from this local variability, whether it be from microclimates or instruments themselves. So when we have this mesoscale variability, it allows us to make a better comparison with the mesoscale model. And so the big takeaways from this is when we look at the observations, the shading here is somewhat surprising where we see warmer temperatures during the daytime or south of the city, which is a pretty vegetated and suburban area. But the model also seems to show that to some degree as well. Nighttime, we also see this temperature pattern starts to change as well. And we see temperatures start to shift along the bay and towards the east of the city. I'm showing all this to say that when we look at this mesoscale variability, the model seems to capture that, but we also do note some of the biases and we're writing that up. A component that I wasn't able to go through is that we are also able to help quantify the value added by these individual stations. So this is really encouraging, especially for some of our BSEC partners where we're able to quantify some of their research and some of the community science that's being done as well. And just to be quick about it, what it ultimately helps us to see is if you look in this panel to the right, this is basically showing a centroid, or you can think of this as basically a warm blob of where the warmest temperatures are. These blue colors are showing nighttime, so in the middle of the night, and then the peak of the day are these orange and red colors. So at night, temperatures are warmest on the east side of the bay, just north of an industrialized area. But during the day, temperatures seem to migrate south of the city as we saw before, which is in the center of that is right over the airport. Oops. And then at nighttime, they kind of make this clockwise loop where they um, loop right around the harbor and end up back towards the eastern side of the city. So overall, this work gives us a sense of how does temperature vary in this greater Baltimore area, and it lets us know what regions are more or less susceptible and at what time of day. And to transition to some of the mitigation work, since we know the most exposed areas, we can think of what if we were to deploy some mitigation strategy there. And so this is done a lot with the WRF model, and particularly with changing the albedo or changing the amount of vegetation. The key problem is that the model is extremely aggressive and essentially applies that everywhere. So from this map is showing land cover, you can think of the model by default applies it to all of these gray and red areas, which is a very large area and which require a lot of cooperation. And so my goal is to update some of this model code so that we can implement this grid level mitigation. So we can go through this essentially grid cell by grid cell. And the other presenters kind of covered some more details about these urban canopy models that we're using. So I'm using a fairly simplistic version of it, but it also equates to some of the inputs which come from an urban parameter table, where depending on your urban categories, you usually set a value, which the default is 0.2 for the albedo. And when somebody tries to implement some mitigation strategy, it's usually the first order, they're tuning some of these parameters. And as I mentioned, ends up getting applied almost throughout your whole domain. And to be very quick about how we're changing some of this methodology is that there are two ways of implementing two data sets within WRF to implement this. One has 3 urban categories, the other has 11. So I'm starting with the 11 category data, which is from WUDAPT, and I am essentially mapping or translating all of these parameters into the data set with 3 categories. The reason being is that leaves us with some additional categories where we can specify the same parameters, but just change the mitigation. So we can just change the roof in certain areas, just change the urban fraction. And so this is what allows us to maybe implement something, say, just in Baltimore, as you see in this panel to the right. Just to give you a visual representation, this panel to the left is changing the albedo, and so this is for the full domain. And because I mentioned this is everywhere, but for example, we can also do this in Baltimore or maybe just low income areas. And same thing for the urban fraction. And to give you a sense of some of the results, I want to start with showing the difference in Tmax. So we have a control simulation with no mitigation, and then we've done it over the full domain, just over Baltimore and low income areas. And to first order, temperatures are decreased about by 1.5 degrees C, especially over these urban areas when we do this full domain. And then as we expect, if you just apply it in Baltimore, this is where the cooling happens. And you'll notice there's a big contrast between the albedo case and then when we change the green space, where green space is much less effective, at least in reducing Tmax. However, when we shift the Tmin, the story essentially flips, where albedo doesn't seem to make much of a difference. However, green space is much more effective at nighttime. So this brings up some very interesting trade-offs if you want to reduce Tmax or Tmin, especially when we think in terms of heat exposure. And not only that, we've also looked at this as a function of wind speed and wind direction. So there's a lot on this plot. So I'm just going to zoom in onto these two plots where all of these markers are times within the month of August where temperature is above 90 degrees. That 90 is fairly arbitrary, but it essentially represents these very hot conditions where mitigation is going to be most important. This box to the left is showing the direction the wind is blowing. And so all these markers are showing the cooling that you get when you, apply the mitigation of the full domain over just Baltimore, and we're looking at Baltimore averages. So when winds are generally calm and blowing towards the north, that's when we get the most cooling over the city of Baltimore, which is averaging about 1 degree C just within that domain. But what's interesting is when you when you apply the mitigation just within the city limits and you no longer have the suburbs, we start to see the cooling becomes less effective, actually about by 20% less effective. And that's alluding to some advection that may be happening from the suburbs. So if you cool the suburbs, you may get some additional cooling in the city. And we also looked at this in terms of relative humidity. I'm showing the exact same plot with relative humidity. And since we're not necessarily changing the vegetation, there's very little change in relative humidity, which is just mainly driven by the cooler ambient temperatures. Just to be complete, I'm showing the changes with urban fraction, which are weaker, but I'm also looking at this during the warmest period. So I just haven't had a chance to get to the nighttime analysis as well, but this is essentially where it's going. We've also looked at this in a few other capacities, but I'll just kind of leave it here for some of the take-home messages, especially with the observations. It's very important to use this large network of observations, and we're able to make good use of these to understand the temperature variability. And we know that WRF is actually a very capable tool in helping us to understand this mesoscale variability. But when it comes to the mitigation, this type of implementation is very important because the default is very ambitious, which could lead to us potentially overestimating how effective some of these strategies are. So going forward is going to be all about quantifying the impacts of the suburbs of these other areas, as well as looking at the dynamical implications. This example for this plot I have to the right, which shows if you apply these strong mitigation approaches, you can also collapse the planetary boundary layer. So that I'll conclude, and I think I'm the last presenter, so we can maybe take a few questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Eliott. Yeah, you guys are awesome, like below 21 minutes. So thanks to all the speakers, fantastic talks. So we do have about 5 minutes for questions for both sets of presenters, the presenters to each other, whatever form of question you would like.
Yeah, I do have one small question for Jason. So Jason, I believe we are using the same local climate zone data, which is the CGLC models LCZ data. So
yeah, right.
How well are the LCZs presented in the models? compared to the reality, because for the Chicago area, we still find out some misrepresentation between the model and reality. So that might explain the differences for the temperature simulation.
I think it is 100% that they're largely misclassified. I didn't get to say that, but yes, I do think that is. And that's kind of one of the reasons I was using actual LiDAR data to derive a lot of those properties, to then kind of compare that. And maybe even, right, you could do a reclassification based on the geometries of the buildings that come from the LiDAR data, but I haven't got to that point. But I think that's exactly right, what you said. I think a lot of them are misclassified. I mean, just knowing that surrounding area as it is, kind of how it's been lumped. Some of the row homes that are largely a composite of that suburban area of Baltimore maybe don't fit into that LCZ classification that has been largely grouped into. Yeah, so I think that's a huge issue. Yeah, for sure. Good point. Good point.
Yeah, thanks.
Fan, go ahead.
Thank you. So I have a question for Dimitrios, and I'm kind of quite interested in the effective mixing lens profile that you showed. I'm wondering whether you can share any of the insights within that, because I'm only aware of seeing a minimum mixing length in the at the canopy for some experiments within the dealing with the fractal trees, and for other measurements, and also some LES studies where we treat the canopy as a distributed drag field, we kind of tend to, in most of the time, we see increase of mixing length with height within the canopy, and sometimes we see almost a constant within the canopy, but we don't very often see like a minimum at the canopy top. So I wonder whether you can share more insights about why that profile is used.
So firstly, there are like some review article by Gilaberti that showed that urban canopies behave significantly different than vegetated flows, which I'm also very familiar with, particularly because the characteristics and lambda p values are always like at the high range, but also because typically we are talking about high Reynolds numbers that actually are at the level that we have a higher mixing at the interface, that eddies basically penetrate, and we have this also the mixing layer at the top that describe these mixes these two boundary layers that form. Now there are like very there are many recent publications that have done systematical analysis of turbulence structure inside canopies, and all of them actually conclude that the behavior inside the canopy is not uniform, and we don't have this this uniformly like increasing size of eddies as you move away. I would say that these approaches of using just a drag force to parameterize the physics of the processes in urban canopies are a little bit oversimplified. That's, for example, one of the reasons why the standard BP model failed to capture this, is because it's derived using Reynolds average equations that typically fail to resolve the canopy variability. This is normal. It's developed like more than 15 years ago. So computational resources were limited. Numerical methods keep evolving. So actually resolving the turbulence have showed us that actually these assumptions are not valid. And there are several review articles published in the last couple of years that actually question the uniform turbulent structure approach in urban canopies particularly.
Yeah, Dimitrios, I thought it was really cool you showed that, because I was thinking of Louis Blund's paper where he basically shows that exact same L profile, with the subcanopy.
The 2023 review
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool when you showed that.
Okay, so we are at the hour. I want to thank the four speakers for the excellent talks. And it's great to see so much interaction and so much similarity between the approaches and comparison across the cities I think will be possible. I want to encourage everyone with remaining questions or notes or compliments to get in touch directly with the speakers. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.